afternoon. I'm Courtney Bailey with Leadership Austin.
And I'm Trenzio Turner with Austin PBS.
So we'd like to welcome everyone to this month's ATX Together Engage series. We gather today at the end of a very difficult few weeks. Our country has witnessed horrific violence in Buffalo, Uvalde, and other cities across the U.S. So we'd like to pause for a moment of silence to honor the memory of those we have lost. Thank you. Our hearts go out to the families and loved ones of those who were taken by the violence.
Thank you, Courtney. Such an important conversation. We will post a link in the chat to a survey about this series. We've added a question about what community conversation you'd like to see take place around the topic of guns. Now, let's dive into the final topic of this Engage series. We'll focus today on the hiring challenges, trends, and strategies in Central Texas. To help with this conversation, we have Veronica Briceño, Assistant City Manager with the City of Austin.
And next we have John Roberts, Principal and Managing Director with TIP Strategies.
And last but not least, Lila Valencia, City Demographer with the City of Austin. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
So according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, over 4 million workers resigned in March of 2022. We'd like to explore what is behind this trend. So John, let's start with you. Is Central Texas labor market unique compared to the rest of the country? And how might that change in the coming months and years?
So thank you for the question, and thank you all for participating. And I'm pleased and honored to be part of this panel. To answer your question, Courtney, like most questions related to the economy, the answer is yes and no. Yes, Austin is unique in the sense that it continues to lead the nation on most employment and job-related indicators. A recent Wall Street Journal study that they commissioned showed Austin is number one in terms of job growth overall. Looking at unemployment rates, labor force participation, which is particularly important, and I think most of you know is different from the unemployment rate. And also in terms of payroll change rank, which we're ranked number one. It is not, however, unique in the sense that it's ever immune from national trends. So if you're thinking about a recession, and I think we all should at least be thinking about it, it will follow, Austin will follow that national trend. It may lag it, and it may come out sooner, but no one is unique when it comes to being able to avoid those broader national trends that are occurring. So that's I think, a way for us to think about it, and love to hear other people's thoughts on this.
Thank you, John.
Veronica, with people moving at a really fast pace to Central Texas from all over the country, including places like California and New York, what are some of the benefits or hiring challenges that we face?
Sure, and thank you also for inviting me to participate today. I'm happy to be a part of this panel. So it does cause a unique challenge for us in Central Texas. Of course, we're very happy that we are a desirable place, and for many decades, folks across the world, but particularly in our country, have wanted to come to Austin. That's a good place to be. It's good to be at the top of the list for the best places to live, best places to work, and so forth. But it does pose a challenge for recruitment and retaining employees when you're looking at the quality of the workforce that we have here in Central Texas, in particular for the City of Austin as an organization. Human resources is within my portfolio as an assistant city manager here at the city. And we've really had to change the way we look at recruiting and retaining employees. We are a government institution, and so we don't have a lot of the flexibility that exists with employers in the private sector. Historically, we've had a vacancy rate of about 11 to 12%. We saw that shoot up in the past year to 16 to 17%, and it's held steady at that level. So we really, our HR team, our human resources team has really taken a look at what are we doing and how can we change the way we do things. We are doing things like looking at how we advertise jobs. Historically, the city tended to advertise mainly on our website and on LinkedIn, and we're realizing that's not the way our newer employees, our newer workforce is looking for opportunities. So we're on Twitter, we're in social media, really getting the word out. We're looking at market studies for specific job classifications where we're seeing a hard time recruiting. For example, engineers is an area where we are conducting a current market study to make sure that we're at market and that we're competitive. We're looking at things like stipends for employees that are committed to working for the city of Austin, and particularly in areas that are hard to recruit, like CDL drivers. We are hiring drivers just like Amazon and everybody else, and we need our drivers because if citizens if we don't have drivers, we're not able to do things like pick up trash. And so making sure that we are looking at those industry specific areas and where can we make some gains and providing some monetary benefits. And then doing things like looking at our living wage, looking at increasing it. Our current living wage rate for the city of Austin is $15 an hour. We realize that it's important to increase that. So looking at what we can do in this coming budget to increase that wage so that we can be a more attractive place for individuals to come work for the city of Austin.
It's interesting, whether it's public or private, everyone's having to get creative right now. Thank you, Veronica.
So Lila, this next question is for you. As the greater Austin population grows, it has expanded outward in all directions, including San Antonio. Are there unique differences between the demography of San Antonio and Austin? And how might the smaller cities between the two areas change over the next decade?
Thanks for that question, Courtney, and I'm happy to be part of the panel in this conversation. And the metro area, like you said, is part of the fastest growing area in the country, not just, recently, but for the last, 11 years. Even more recent data show that we are still the fastest growing metro in the country. And of course, some of that growth is now expanding to other metros like the San Antonio metro area. And there are a few differences between the San Antonio demography and that of Austin. And namely, what has made Austin very competitive is that it has one of the most highly educated workforces. And that continues to be the case. And as we grow, especially from a lot of migration from other large metro areas in the state, but also other states across the country, we bring a lot of very skilled talent to the region. And so in Austin, we have that high educated workforce, but we also have higher cost of living. And so we know that many people are really strapped for resources in terms of affordability here in the city of Austin that is not yet happening in the San Antonio metro area. Now, of course, as growth starts to take place there, they may start to see some of these challenges as well. But right now, those are some of the big differences between the two areas. And then as for the cities in between, those are the cities that are really seeing a lot of that growth. The city of Austin is growing very rapidly. The city of San Antonio added the most people of any large city in the country this last year. But those cities in between are the ones that are growing the fastest. For instance, Georgetown and Leander were number 1 and number 2 among the fastest growing cities in the nation. And so those cities are really, it's going to be really important that they're positioned in a way where they can absorb that growth and that their infrastructure sees some investments in order for them to really be able to bolster that economic growth.
Thank you for that, Lila.
All right, we're going to keep it moving. I want to remind our audience that if you have questions for our panel, please drop those in the chat. We'd love to hear from you and love to share those questions with them. This next round of questions will be open to all three of you, so anyone feel free to jump in and answer. According to a recent Deloitte survey, 2 in 5 Gen Zers and a quarter of millennials say they will leave their current role by next year. What's the driving force behind this trend, and how will this change our workforce? Gen Z, millennials, lots of talk. I know there's something there.
I can talk a little bit to the part of the question that is related to demography, right? And so part of that Great Resignation and is going to come not just from millennials and Gen Z, but also from the baby boom generation. That generation right now is still in the aging process into post-retirement age, and it will continue to be so through 2030. And so many employees currently right now in the workforce are looking at those retirement options and really heavily considering them because they are in this stage of life. And so I think that's definitely part of what we're seeing when we're talking about the Great Resignation.
Yeah.
And I would say, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Veronica, you go ahead.
I was going to add from the city's perspective, in addition to that, when we're looking at retirement, because of the city's retirement plan, you have a lot of employees that are Gen Z and eligible for retirement. So we are no different than any other entity in having a workforce that experienced personally and professionally as in being a public servant, responding to a pandemic. And so I think we are seeing those trends of folks taking account of what's important in their life and so forth, and changing their priorities and how they prioritize the time that they would have committed to the current position they have.
I agree with that. And I think there's the other side of the equation, which is from the employer side, really, I think is forcing people to ask, what is your value proposition vis-a-vis your employees? And part of that discussion is just wages, of course, how much you can earn. And I think a lot of those who have dropped out of the workforce have come to the conclusion that through a combination of gig work and alternative sources of funds, they can do just as well as they would do under regular wage structure. And then you add to there's a gender component to that, and certainly COVID has contributed hugely to the sense that that the demands that are being placed on workers may be greater than the benefits. And you're seeing that play out right now. You saw Elon Musk's now already famous pronouncement that he expects everyone to be back at the office in person. That can be, and it echoes what Jamie Dimon said about J.P. Morgan Chase a few months earlier than that. That this expectation now, I don't think that expectation can be met. I don't think it's reasonable, but I think that discussion is part and parcel of what we mean by a value proposition from the employer side. Now, I'd be delighted to hear what Lila and Veronica have to say about this, but this is all assuming that the economy stays relatively robust, which it has. And will that change when hiring slows? And I think we're all reading the same articles in the journal and elsewhere that shows a retraction already in the service sector. Retailers and others are seeing slowing in demand, and that I think may change that equation between available labor and demand. So it's a very uncertain time, and I wouldn't jump. I'm not entirely comfortable with the term Great Resignation. It's been too short a period of time to reach a conclusion about that yet, and the pendulum may well swing, and may still swing relatively quickly back in favor of the employers. And I'd love to hear what y'all have to think about that.
Lila, Veronica, would you want to respond to what John shared?
So I think John's absolutely right. Earlier he mentioned sort of the shifts and swings in the economy, and really thinking through, into the future, the possibility of a future recession given inflation. And I think that those are absolutely, things that people who are currently in the workforce and making decisions, should keep in mind. One of the things that I saw in some of the Census Bureau's pulse surveys that was very interesting was even at the peak of the pandemic, when the recession was really tanking, entrepreneurship skyrocketed. It increased by about 24%. And a lot of that, of course, was driven by this value proposition, again, that John's mentioning, where people, were getting a new perspective, really, because of the pandemic, and really focusing on what was most important to them, and really needing to be able to set those flexible schedules, flexible work environments, even their own safety measures that they felt most comfortable with. And we know that many of those challenges were met by some people by starting their own business. And so I think that that's definitely, something that lets us know that people are going to keep, aware and maintain awareness of what the economy is doing, but they also have a renewed sense of, I need to focus on what's most important to me and how my work is going to benefit from that.
And I would also agree, and I appreciate John's question of, employers really need to ask themselves, what is the value add? And I think employers are doing that. There is more opportunity for working from home now that we know that we can do that, and we can be more flexible in that regard. There is looking at how do we value our workforce, not only from a monetary perspective, but from a non-monetary perspective as well. And I do think it ebbs and flows. I'm glad Lila brought up the mention of entrepreneurship. I think we've seen that in other downturns, when we've experienced a downturn and folks have gone back to start businesses or start a different career. And so it works itself out. And I think right now we're just feeling what our reality is looking like coming out of the pandemic, and it will calm down, and we will have some stability in that sense in the future.
So speaking of like values and priorities, what advice would you all have for those employees who are seeking to quit their jobs during this time?
If you work for the city of Austin, don't do it, please. Unless it's another job in the city of Austin. I think, we're speaking to some of those things, looking for an employer who's going to value you as a individual, value the priorities that you have, thinking about what those priorities are, to John's point, and what that position is and how does it fit with those priorities, and looking at the potential wage earning and the cost of living that we're struggling with here in Central Texas, ensuring that as you make a move, it is a move that will continue the opportunity to afford the cost of living that you have for yourself and your dependents.
John or Lila, any? You're like, we don't know.
Yes, I think it's definitely, it can, something to consider, with some, with good degree, right? And it shouldn't be something that you jump into, but I think making sure that, that you have other options already lined up, that the place where you're going, like Veronica said, is going to be offering you, value as an employee, and offering you that flexibility that you might be looking for. Or if it's your own sort of business, making sure that you do the research and understand the market and your clientele that's available, understanding, what the capital costs are that you're going to need going in, looking for assistance, like with the city in terms of small business assistance, but making sure that you are aware also that, the quality of life is important, for people's health, for time that you spend with your children. All of those outcomes are also important, when you're making considerations for these things. So keep those things in mind, not just, the paycheck aspect of it.
No, I completely agree with that. And I think that job seekers, and I'd like to turn this conversation to employers as well, because there's some lessons for them. But I think it's a typical problem with job seekers that they're focused on themselves and not on what their place in the organization that they want to join would be. In other words, the value proposition really has to come from both sides. And from that person seeking employment, especially if they're currently unemployed, there's a lot of stress in being unemployed. And the ability to say, this is how I can advance the goals of the organization that I intend to join by matching my skills to that organization. It's something that I think career counselors have tried to stress throughout the period that we have high unemployment, but that's a very different situation right now. And there's still an awful lot of people who are not. We have the highest labor force participation rate in the country. And let me just digress for a moment. I think for those people who don't live in this space, we need to make sure everybody understands that the unemployment rate is always a little bit misleading, because what it doesn't capture is those people who have dropped out of the workforce and are no longer seeking a job. So you're only unemployed as long as the federal government sees you as seeking a job through unemployment benefits and so forth. So the labor force participation rate is a much clearer picture. Now, we're still number one in labor force participation, but I think that there are a significant number of people in the greater Austin area who would like to be employed and who aren't. And reaching those, and this is where I wanted to segue to kind of discussion about how employers need to be more creative, because some of that dropout, some of that resignation is a function of not being able to communicate the values that organization has beyond what the initial wage structure is. And that's especially true right now, I think, in the service sector. And I'd love to get Lila and Veronica's notion of that distinction between the service sector, which is still our largest employment cohort, and how that's going to change, especially in terms of so much online retail and changed expectations post-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you all taking the time to offer that advice, because even though, yes, we're number one in the labor market, as Lala mentioned, quality of life still has a weight, and so I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John, let's stay there on business and industry. What industries have been hit the hardest since the pandemic, and how do you think they can recover?
Yeah, I think this is the way in which we are and we are not unique. We're not unique in the sense that the same thing that hits the nation hits us. And certainly the service sector it was devastated during COVID. And the return from it now is especially difficult. And what's happening, and again, I'd love other people's thoughts and questions on this. What's happening is that a lot of the smaller businesses simply can't meet the wage demands of their employees. They understand it. They understand that anything less than $20 an hour is still a stress on many individuals and many families. But $20 an hour for a small business, and you can quickly do the calculations on what that would mean on an hourly basis. 10 employees at $20 an hour is $200 an hour. And if you think of some of the smaller businesses and retailers, that's a huge burden. And so it's one thing to say, why can't we pay a living wage? It's another to realize that the stress on those businesses at those higher wage rates they wouldn't be viable anymore. So I think we have to be realistic. We have to take a hard-nosed view of how stressful that is. And the other component of the larger business is at what point do the lines of wages cross my ability to automate and to be able to meet consumer demand without increasing my hiring at all through various kinds of automation. And that includes the service sector. And I think, that's something that isn't talked about enough. But I think all of you, if you've shopped at all, I happen to have been in Nordstrom's up at the Domain, and the number of employees available compared to what it was pre-pandemic, it was a little bit shocking. It looked like 1/10 of the workforce. And what I see happening there is a move from the traditional sales person to more of a concierge service, that they're providing value in a different way. So fewer people at higher wages providing value in a different, according to a different model than they have in the past. They're not just people that will take your credit card and run it. That really is becoming less and less necessary. So I'd love to have some of the questions addressed, and maybe Lilac and Veronica can do that as well.
Yeah, Lila, Veronica, feel free to jump in on this one.
Yeah, a couple of industries that come to mind when we're talking about the ones that are hardest hit, and I think it's really any of the ones where there was a large expectation for in-person service. So definitely like the service sector, but then also thinking about our teachers. So many teachers are talking about retiring or quitting their job, doing something else in education, and we started off this segment with a moment of silence, in part because of a shooting in a school. And so really thinking again about, the demands that are being placed on employees and what the pay is for those employees is going to become really, really important when people are getting this new perspective and are really trying to focus on their passions, on the things that are most important in life. And, the teaching industry is definitely one that comes to mind. Another is the nursing industry. We talked about, this is a continuation of a shortage. We've had a nursing shortage for quite a while, but the pandemic absolutely did not help that profession either. And so again, thinking about what are the wages for workers that have this very, very high stress level, high demand kind of work, and considering, a better balance of that.
There's another component to this that we've looked at very closely in communities across the country, and that is the racial demographics, if you will, of the ability to work from home from those who don't. So there is and this is really important, and I think a lot of people in economic development and in public policy are struggling with this, because those who were able to work remotely at the beginning of the pandemic see that as a continuing advantage. But when you look at the racial demographics of those who can work remotely versus those who can't because of the nature of their job, it skews very, very heavily toward white and Asian, and skews for those who can't work remotely, skews heavily to Black and Hispanic. So if we're not aware of how that's playing out in all sorts of ways in Austin, including the housing market and the affordability of the housing market, I think we can be fooled by our good numbers.
I agree with everything that's been said. I would add one industry to the conversation that is somewhat unique to Austin, and that's our live music industry. I think we saw our musicians really take a hit in the pandemic, and in the good sense, that's coming back as people are enjoying getting out and socializing again in Central Texas. But it's an area that we need to be cognizant of, because going back to one of the first questions about people moving here, one of the main reasons they're moving here is because of our culture, including things like live music and live music venues and musicians. And it goes back to that affordability discussion, if we don't find ways to keep and retain our music industry, then we'll lose part of who we are as a city. So I think that's also important as we're talking about these different industries, and something that Austin, other cities of course face it, but something that we've really prided ourselves in and really developed here as a city.
Thank you all for that. We do have an audience question, so I apologize in advance if I do not say your name correctly. I do apologize. But the question is from Kritayalex Isabunto. How can wealth trickle down? Can y'all collectively advocate for across the board student loan forgiveness, reparations, give us land and property? That's what we need. So please address. So I guess how do we collectively advocate for these things that have come up in the last 2 years? Student loan forgiveness, reparation has been a conversation that has come up. Any thoughts on that?
I can't really speak to the advocacy, but one of the things that I can speak to is so much of the sort of support that was put forth through the Biden administration in light of the pandemic really demonstrated how helpful that can be to people's incomes and their wages and their quality of life. So we saw, direct assistance regarding the, child income tax credit and other assistance, and just the being able to defer payments on student loans really was able to help people get through a very difficult economic recession. And so absolutely, I don't know exactly how we would go about advocating for that, but those programs, assistance programs, have definitely been shown to be helpful in helping people get past this.
Okay, thank you for that. There's another comment from Isa. She says, pay us a living wage, pay teachers more, we can't afford to live, period. And so that speaks to what came up before about folks, like the affordability issue of folks moving outside of like Austin, where they can live. But then many people are more than likely having to like still travel within the city to get work, right? So do you think this rapid growth that we're experiencing in Central Texas, is it harming or helping our rural areas? What are your thoughts?
I think I'll jump in. I think it's definitely to the good. The stresses associated with growth are very real, housing affordability, traffic, et cetera. But I can tell you from the communities that we work with across the country, they would much rather be Austin than be losing their talent and struggling to have a sustainable tax base. So yes, it's a pain, it's a stress, and there's no question that we're pushing out further from our boundaries just because of affordability, and that puts additional strain on those who can't work remotely. But I think you have to see it in the context of what it would mean not to grow. And I'd love to hear Lila and Veronica weigh in on that, because it doesn't make it easy for us, but it's better than not.
I would definitely say that for sure it's both, because with growth, and absolutely, our like metro area is the fastest growing metro area in the country and has been for over 10 years. And this is during a time when there is population decline happening all over the country. And so absolutely, it is something that it's a good problem to have. However, it's still a problem because we have seen, in part because of the fast growth, the exacerbation of affordability issues. And unfortunately, many of those affordability issues, and as we were speaking earlier, are going to fall most heavily on populations of color. African American incomes are much lower, 1.6 times lower, I believe, than white incomes. Home ownership is lower for African Americans and Latinos. And so when we're talking specifically about affordability issues, it's going to affect those communities of color. And I think what we really need to, work with is in turning that growth into a real strength for the city and being able to more equitably distribute those economic gains that we're seeing with all of that growth. And not forgetting about those rural communities that are also growing very rapidly, in those suburban communities, because without the investments into infrastructure, we're just going to further exacerbate not just the affordability issue, but the quality of life issues associated with increased commute times and lack of amenities in other parts of the more rural parts of the metro area.
I completely agree. My former role at the city was the economic development director, and one thing that we were looking at in economic development and continue to look at is there's only so much growth Austin can sustain. And so transferring more from the perspective of what Austin is doing, but looking at our region and looking at it as a region and working with our regional partners, looking at as businesses are coming to Austin, they might not be in Austin Central, they might be in Hutto or in other parts of our community. But to Lila's point, we also have to be cognizant of as that growth spreads, we don't want to have those same negative impacts on our rural communities and communities outside of Austin. So hoping that some of the rapid growth we have have experienced in Austin doesn't have the same impact of affordability issues and so forth in other communities, I think is key.
Thank you.
I want to pick up on a question. Someone mentioned the gig economy earlier. What role, if any, does the rise of the gig economy jobs play in the Great Resignation for our region?
I think it has a really significant role, but I know that Lila and Veronica know this. A lot of what happens in the gig economy is not measurable. And, just as with the unemployment rate, it's a little misleading because if you drop out, it doesn't show. And a lot of the benefits of the gig economy are not realized because you're working in a gray market. And I think there's a significant portion of our workforce which doesn't appear, which is in the gig economy, and doesn't show up at all, including the IRS. And economists they've struggled with this for a long time. They know it's there, but again, it can't easily be measured. But I think it is a way for a significant portion of our population that has dropped out of the workforce to continue to make ends meet. And yes, go ahead, Courtney.
So before you go on, can you explain to those who are watching, just in case they don't know, what's gig economy?
So loosely speaking, the gig economy is when you are getting remunerative benefits. In other words, you're getting paid to do things, but you're not working for an employer. So from a statistical level, you don't show up in the labor market unless, of course, you are filing taxes for that gig. So basically, it's a combination of part-time work without a steady employer. Is that a fair enough definition, Lila, Veronica?
Absolutely, and I think just offering some examples, right, that we're pretty common with, it's typically going to be, your Uber drivers or your Lyft drivers. And I would even, add to that sort of gig economy is, people with short-term rentals, which we are seeing quite a bit of in the city of Austin as well. So it's definitely difficult to measure. And then the burdens for that subsector of the economy is also difficult to measure. We know that because they are working or providing these services, but not necessarily employed, they don't necessarily have employee benefits. And so I think during the pandemic, one of the things that became very, very clear was that having steady health insurance coverage is very important. And so there's going to be a lot of other protections that more traditional employee or employers can offer to employees that gig employers or gig workers are not going to receive.
Thank you for that. We do have an audience question from Sandy Doshin. It's kind of long, so bear with me. What helps many employers is the presence of childcare for their employees' kids. Many childcare during COVID, fewer kids, more expenses. The conundrum is that there's a huge demand for childcare, and yet its employees get low wages and profit margins for center owners are tight. How is that sector recovering or changing?
Well, hi, Sandy, first of all. And I'd love for Lila and Veronica to address this, but I will say we did a project in Richmond, Virginia, and we made the recommendation that childcare providers rethink their own potential as and this gets very close to the way you would think about unions, but think of more of it as a guild. What if we were more creative in the way that we certify and manage childcare? And this is a very long and to me interesting discussion, but I would love to hear what others have to say about it, because I think there is an institutional opportunity. Maybe that's not the right word. There's an opportunity here to think differently about the way that child care is provided.
I wish I had some statistics for you, Sandy, but I haven't looked specifically at, the recovery of that particular sector. But I know that it's definitely one of those that, as I was mentioning earlier, where whenever there was that greater demand for in person or sort of the lack of moving away to more virtual options, which of course is difficult to do with childcare, but it's one of those industries again that were very, very hardly hit. And, going into the pandemic, we were seeing some of the highest labor force participation rates by women with children, especially women with young children. And during the pandemic, we know that, that dropped dramatically, and it's still not back to where it was pre-pandemic. And a lot of that has to do with just the instability of school days and, whether there's going to be school closures and the possibility of having that childcare option. And so childcare is absolutely going to be critical in making sure that we are able to get to a full recovery, not just for that particular industry, but also for many women with children who are trying to get back into the workforce.
So one of the silver linings, I think, of the pandemic is while childcare was unearthed as a huge issue, it really catapulted into the conversation the importance of childcare when we're talking about employers, when we're talking about it as an economic development need and essential need. It also, here at the city, one of the things I'm proud of is we provided relief programs for childcare centers during the pandemic. But that also unearthed the inequity in childcare and inequality childcare. I shouldn't say unearthed, that's been something that folks have known about. But when you're looking at data and applying relief funds and seeing where the childcare centers are located in our city that do have the different accreditations as opposed to where they don't, it really begged the question of how not only the availability of childcare is important, but also quality childcare, and quality childcare for all communities, including our communities of color, is critical. We also, as a city, our city council passed an ordinance that has us looking to the point of on-site childcare, looking at every city development that we look at and every office space that we're looking at to provide childcare on site as well. So that is on our forefront as we're looking at our own facilities, redevelopment and new developments. As a potential, because we are one of the largest employers in the city, and it is important that employees have access to childcare so that they are able to come to work and focus on work while they're here and enjoy their children while they're out of the office.
And in Trenzio, I would add one more dimension to this discussion, and that is elder care. So you have childcare on the one end, and you have elder care on the other. And the increase, you mentioned the aging of the baby boom generation. I think the burden of elder care is going to rival that of childcare. And again, there's important gender distinctions to be made here, because typically the burden of both childcare and elder care falls on women. And so how we accommodate that from both an employer standpoint and from a social service standpoint, I think is really critical. And the dismal state of our elder care facilities is mirrored by the still low standards of a lot of the childcare. So I think from a social service, we had a question earlier about what more can be done on behalf of especially communities of color. Well, I think that both of those areas are from my perspective, at least in the communities that we worked in, as important a first step to take as any. And it's not low-hanging fruit, but it's attainable. In other words, you can get there. Creative solutions if you identify them as such and you work toward them. And I know there's a lot of competing priorities, but I would say that the burden of childcare and elder care are as great as any that a family is going to face.
Thank you for that. Trenzio, we do have an audience question. You want to get that last one?
Absolutely. Looks like it is directed at you, Veronica. It says, can you speak to the new Hire Local, there's quotes there, program by Workforce Solutions Capital Area, and the scholarships the city of Austin are providing for 1,000 people?
I can't speak to specifics, unfortunately. I did have a strong role. I was on the Workforce Solutions Board and had a role with economic development partners with Workforce Solutions, as does our health department as well. And we've had a longstanding partnership. Workforce Solutions has started a campaign of hire local, so that as employers are coming to a community and existing employers expand, that they're looking at our existing workforce and considering our existing workforce. And Workforce Solutions is a key partner in providing the skill sets and training up our workforce that is here local. But I'm not familiar with the scholarship. Happy to find out some more information on that.
Thank you for that, Veronica. One more question. We were talking about equity, right? So how do you think our leaders have been faring in addressing economic inequities in our region? Your honest opinion.
Really poorly. And and Veronica, please jump on me. But we at TIP are strong advocates of public-private partnerships. And I had the privilege of working on the Mueller project when it went forward, and I looked at interest at the Grove. Those of you who have been in Austin know the Grove is just east of Mopac, between 35th and 45th, roughly, and the city had a real opportunity there to participate. First of all, to buy the land from TxDOT, and then to do sort of a mini version of Mueller and put affordable housing units onto the Grove. And again, it was, just for those of you who didn't follow it, it was state-owned land, and the state offered it to the city first. It was a prime opportunity for the city to step in and get that land at a bargain rate, and put affordable housing units on there. None of that happened. It went entirely to Millstone, and what you have now is something that is not affordable. So the sense that a city can address these questions not in an abstract way, but in a very practical way, to say, where's the land that is available to us for development, and available to us either because we own it or because we can strike deals with other public entities. Those are the kinds of questions that I don't see the city taking on in a very realistic way. And forgive me, Veronica, if I don't mean this to be a challenge to you in any way, but maybe I do. Maybe I'm saying that the city can do a lot more on questions of, certainly in terms of housing affordability.
So I don't disagree. I think, the city, it's a tough question. It's something we struggle with every day as city leaders, something that our city council struggles with every council meeting. And going back to Mueller in particular, that was one of our very first third-party developments, and we've learned so much since then. Now, when we're looking at redevelopment, when we're looking at opportunities like that, we're leading with the community values that we see in store. Economic development right now has a project called in the Colony Park community, looking at how can we help that community have some amenities that they don't enjoy right now, but doing that with the lens of not being a Mueller, having it so that it's a community where the neighbors that live in that community now can stay. And so we haven't done the best historically, but we very much are trying to identify those very real tools that we can assist in helping folks stay in their homes and not get displaced. I know in our housing and planning department, they're doing quite a bit of work in anti-displacement, but we should have, I think that's something we would all agree, this is something that we should have focused on decades ago. And our growth just really was just unprecedented. It continues to be unprecedented, and we're dealing with some of those after effects, a lot of those after effects.
And I think for sure, city leaders absolutely have a role to play, but it's really bringing leaders together from all across the region that's going to be the most effective and provide the best solutions. And so I think I would like to see more of that sort of regional collaboration to really address these issues that don't, stay within city boundaries and city limits. They really, start to affect the entire region.
Thank y'all for answering that question so candidly. Thank you.
Before we get to our call to action, I want to remind folks to complete our brief survey at the end of this panel. That includes giving us your thoughts on the community discussion around guns. We would really appreciate your input.
So for our call to action, what steps can organizations and companies take to improve hiring and retention issues? And how can employees better advocate for themselves during this time? So it's like two parts. I'll start with, I'll go back to you, Lila.
Sure. So I think for employers, I think they're really going to have to understand, right, that, and I think many do, that the pandemic has changed everything. And employees are going to have a different focus, and really right now it is an employee market, and they are going to make greater demands, and understanding just how well those meeting those demands in creative and innovative ways is going to produce a more content workforce. It's going to make things easier in terms of retention, right? And then I think for workers who are looking to stay, it's really, I think, would be to focus on, what drives their passions, and making sure that they're honing those skills, getting that training to be able to compete with so many new workers that are coming into the region. And I think that really does also kind of kick it back to employers, making sure that the growth models aren't just focused on bringing in talent, but also on retaining and hiring within the region as well.
John, you want to add to that?
Well, I appreciate what Lila said, and I think that's right. It's complicated. It's complicated because, as I mentioned earlier, and this is sometimes a hard pill to swallow, but businesses can be successful only when they can achieve their margins. And this is especially true of small businesses. And so the question of the value proposition I mentioned earlier really has to come from both sides. Businesses are going to have to be more aware and more focused in terms of what they expect from their workforce, because there's that gap. But I think those people who are looking for employment are also going to have to be more realistic about just how thin some of the margins of smaller businesses are, and then you add to that the question of increased automation, and you realize that the kind of advantageous position that we're in right now, by that I mean from a labor standpoint, is not going. It's not a permanent condition. And we're all guilty of this. We all are guilty of thinking that the way things are now, the way that they're going to continue to be. And I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that we're going to continue with this really low unemployment rate and kind of a buyer's market in terms of employees. I think it's very possible that this pendulum is going to swing. And if it does, back to the earlier comment that you made, if you're working for the city, don't quit. And I think so. There's really, I think you're right, Veronica. I think it's. I think we have to anticipate that swing in the pendulum.
Veronica, you want to close us out?
I agree with everything that was said. I think what's key is to listening to your workforce. I think our employees are our top priority, and really hearing them and seeing where they're at. I think employers have learned in these past couple of years, we have to be nimble. We have to know how to pay attention and see how we can do things differently and work with our workforce. So I think that those are all key points.
All right. This has been great. Thank you so much, Veronica Brasino, John Roberts, and Lila Valencia for sharing your expertise on today's topic. And again, we'd like to encourage you to fill out the survey. The link is in the comments. And if you'd like to watch past discussions from this season of ATX Together, the Engage series, they can be found on either of our websites.
So y'all, today is the last of this year's Engage series. So we'd like to thank the panelists and audience members who contributed to this season. It's all of you who have made these discussions on these important topics so compelling. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. On behalf of Leadership Austin and Austin PBS, thank you for joining us. Have a great summer.